6 weeks after I buried my wife. I walked into our bakery before sunrise and found my daughter-in-law photographing Eleanor's recipe book on the prep table. My son stood beside her, not stopping her, not even looking ashamed. When I asked what they were doing, Madison closed the book with her manicured hand and said, "Your wife's recipes are worth more than her memory. Stop acting like love pays the bills." She did not know Eleanor had left me more than recipes. My name is Arthur Whitman. I am 72 years old, and for 47 years. I was married to a woman named Eleanor who could turn flour, butter, sugar, and grief into something warm enough to make strangers feel less alone. We lived in Ashland, Oregon, and in a narrow house behind the bakery we built from an old shoe repair shop on a quiet street near the plaza. Tourists passed by in summer with cameras around their necks. College students came in during winter with wet hair and empty stomachs, and local teachers stopped before school. Nurses came after night shifts. Widowers sat alone near the window, pretending to read newspapers while waiting for Eleanor to place a warm muffin beside their coffee without charging them. And the sign above the door said Eleanor's Table. That name was her idea. She said a bakery was not just an oven and a register. It was a table extended into the street, a place where the lonely could sit without explaining why they looked tired. And we did not start with money. We started with debt, faith, and a commercial mixer older than our son. I had been a delivery driver for a produce company, then later a warehouse supervisor. Eleanor baked from home before the state rules and common sense forced us into a proper kitchen. For years, I woke at 3:30 every morning to unload flour sacks and scrub pans before driving to my real job. Eleanor shaped dough, with hands that cracked in winter and burned in summer. She wrote recipes in a blue notebook with a cracked spine, adjusting them 1 teaspoon at a time. People thought her cinnamon plum rolls were magic. They were not magic. They were 26 failed batches, 3 arguments, 1 ruined Thanksgiving, and a note in the margin that said, "Arthur was right about more butter, but never tell him." Her honey pear scones paid our winter heating bill 1 year. Her lemon rosemary shortbread got us written up in a regional food magazine. Her cardamom morning buns brought people in from Medford, Eugene, and sometimes even Portland. But Eleanor never cared about sounding famous. She cared whether the old man in the blue cap had eaten. She cared whether the new mother with twins could sit for 10 quiet minutes. She cared whether our son Daniel understood that work was not punishment. It was how love kept its promises. Daniel grew up in that bakery. He slept in a carrier under the counter when he was a baby. He did homework at table 4. He stole chocolate chips from the pantry and blamed mice. Eleanor let him press dough with both hands and called him her little baker, though he hated waking early and loved the praise more than the work. We tried not to spoil him. I think we failed in the quiet ways parents often fail. We gave him what we had never had. We paid for his college when he changed majors twice. We helped with rent after his first startup collapsed. And when he married Madison, we paid for the rehearsal dinner and let them use the bakery courtyard for the reception, because Eleanor believed a wedding should begin in a place that smelled like bread. Madison was beautiful in a polished city way. She had perfect eyebrows, perfect posture, and a voice that became sweeter whenever customers were watching. She worked in marketing, which impressed Daniel more than it impressed me. She talked about scaling, branding, digital conversion, market capture, and visual identity. Eleanor listened politely, and then went back to folding dough, because some people use big words when they want to sound taller than the room. Still, Eleanor tried with her. She gave Madison one of her aprons. And she taught her how to braid challah. She showed her the old recipe book and said each stain had a story. Madison smiled and said the book had great brand potential. And that was the first time I saw Eleanor's face change. She did not correct Madison. Eleanor rarely corrected people in public, but that night after we closed, and she placed the blue recipe book back in the locked cabinet under the office shelf and said, "Some people look at a family table and only see what they can sell from it. I should have listened harder." And then Eleanor got sick. It started as fatigue, then pain, then tests, then the kind of doctor-as appointment where the room becomes too quiet before anyone speaks. The bakery changed after that. I took over more of the front counter. Our longtime baker, Ruthie, handled the morning production. Daniel offered to help with the business side, and Madison said she could modernize our online presence while Eleanor focused on treatment. Eleanor was grateful, or maybe she wanted to be. By the time she died, Eleanor's table had been open 34 years. Every table had scratches I knew by memory. Every wall held photographs of customers who had become friends. Every recipe carried my wife's handwriting somewhere in its bones. After the funeral, I thought Daniel and Madison stayed around because they loved her. I thought they wanted to keep her table standing. I did not yet understand that they had been waiting for the chair at the head of it to become empty. The first strange sign was the new logo. Madison showed it to me 3 days after the funeral. and before I had even taken Eleanor's coat from the hook in the back office. She opened her laptop at the bakery counter and turned the screen toward me with the smile of someone presenting a gift I had not asked for. And the words Eleanor's table were gone. In their place, written in thin black letters on a cream background, was Table Hearth Bakehouse. I stared at it. Madison explained that the old name was too personal and too regional, too dependent on a woman who was no longer here to be the face of the brand. She said the new name felt cleaner, more scalable, more appealing to younger customers. And Daniel nodded beside her and said Mom would want the bakery to survive. I told them the bakery had survived just fine with her name on the sign. Madison's smile tightened. She said survival was not growth, and that was how it began. Not with a theft I could point to, not with a locked door forced open. It began with language. Survive became scale. Customers became traffic. Recipes became intellectual property. Eleanor became legacy assets. I hated that phrase most. Legacy assets, as if my wife had not been a person, as if she were a folder of things to monetize after death in the weeks that followed. And Madison moved through the bakery like a consultant who had mistaken herself for an owner. She rearranged the pastry case. She told Ruthie. The cinnamon plum rolls looked rustic in a bad way. And she replaced Eleanor's handwritten menu cards with printed labels in a font so thin I could barely read them. She stopped letting customers pin thank you notes near the register because she said clutter hurt the visual experience. And Daniel backed her every time. He said Madison understood the modern market. He said I was grieving and clinging to the past. He said if we wanted the bakery to stay alive, we had to think bigger than one old storefront. One old storefront. That old storefront had paid his tuition, his hospital bills, his braces, his wedding flowers, and 3 months of his mortgage when his consulting job vanished. Then Madison began asking about passwords. First the bakery email, then the social media accounts, then the online ordering platform, then the wholesale list, then the vendor contacts, and then the safe in the back office where Eleanor kept the recipe book, the original lease, old tax records, trademark certificates, and letters from customers. I told her I would handle the safe. She smiled and said of course. But later that day I saw Daniel standing near it, turning the dial slowly, pretending to wipe dust from the shelf when I walked in. I did not accuse him. And not yet. Eleanor had taught me that people reveal more when they believe they are not being watched. The next sign came from Ruthie. She had worked for us 22 years. And arriving at 4 in the morning with a thermos of coffee and a back brace she refused to wear until Eleanor scolded her. Ruthie came to me one afternoon after Madison left and asked if we were changing the morning bun recipe. I said no. Ruthie showed me a printed prep sheet Madison had given her. It reduced butter by a third, replaced local honey with corn syrup, and changed the proofing time to move more batches through faster. At the bottom, Madison had written, "Use Eleanor name for now, transition later. For now." I folded the sheet and put it in my pocket. Then came the online store. Madison launched it without asking me, and she said it was just a soft test. She sold boxed shortbread, scone mix, granola, and something she called Eleanor's original morning bun kit. The photograph showed Eleanor's blue mixing bowl, Eleanor's handwritten recipe page, blurred in the background, and Madison's hand sprinkling sugar across dough she had not made. The product description said, inspired by generations of family baking. Inspired. Not stolen, not copied, inspired. When I asked Daniel why they had used Eleanor's bowl and recipe book without asking, he looked tired. He said we needed money. He said hospital bills had hurt the business. He said Madison was trying to help. He said Mom would not want me fighting over pictures. Pictures, that was the second time my son used a small word to make a large betrayal seem harmless. And then a customer named Helen brought me a package she had ordered online. She thought I would be proud. The box had no Eleanor's table logo on it. It had Madison's new table hearth mark. Inside was shortbread made from my wife's recipe, packed with a card that said, "From our founder's treasured family collection." Our founder, Madison, had begun writing herself into Eleanor's story. That night, after closing, I stood in the office and looked at the locked cabinet. Eleanor's recipe book was still inside. The blue cover was worn at the corners. A ribbon marked the page for lemon rosemary shortbread. Her handwriting leaned slightly to the right, as if always moving forward. I placed my hand on the cabinet door but did not open it. I was afraid if I opened the book I would hear her voice and come apart, and so I left it locked. That was my mistake the morning. I found Madison photographing the recipe book. Began with rain. Oregon rain is not dramatic. It does not smash against the windows or shout on the roof. It settles in. It darkens the sidewalk. It makes street lights glow too long after sunrise. It makes the whole world smell like wet leaves and coffee grounds. I arrived at the bakery at 4:20 instead of 5, because sleep had become unreliable since Eleanor died. Some nights I woke reaching toward her side of the bed before remembering there was no warmth there. And some mornings I went to the bakery early because the oven still made sense. Preheat, mix, shape, bake, cool, sell. A process with steps. Grief does not offer that kindness. The front door was unlocked. That was wrong. Ruthie had Mondays off. Daniel never arrived before 8 unless there was a problem. Madison did not believe in mornings unless they involved meetings or airports. I stepped inside quietly. The bakery smelled wrong. Not bad, just wrong. No yeast blooming, no butter warming, no coffee brewing. Only cold air, damp wool from my coat, and the faint metallic scent of the office safe. A light was on in the back. I walked toward it. Madison stood at the prep table with Eleanor's blue recipe book open in front of her. Her phone was held above the page, camera clicking softly. Daniel stood beside her with a stack of papers. He saw me first. His face drained of color, then filled too quickly with annoyance, the way guilty people become angry to hide that they are afraid. And Madison did not even flinch. She took one more photograph before lowering the phone. I asked what they were doing. Daniel said they were organizing. I looked at the recipe book, Eleanor's book, the one she had kept locked for decades, the one she touched only with clean hands, the one she once told me should never be left open near people who did not understand hunger and work and gratitude. I asked how they got it. Daniel looked away. Madison closed the book with her manicured hand resting flat on the cover, as if she owned not only the pages but the woman who had written them. She said they were moving the bakery forward. She said Eleanor's recipes were valuable, and value had to be protected from sentiment. She said I was letting grief make me irrational. I told her those recipes belonged to my wife. Madison gave a small laugh. Then she said the sentence I will hear until the day I die: your wife's recipes are worth more than her memory. Stop acting like love pays the bills. For a moment, the bakery disappeared. I saw Eleanor at 28, standing in our apartment kitchen with flour on her cheek, telling me she thought people would pay for her pear scones. I saw her at 40, asleep at the prep table after making 600 cookies for a school fundraiser. I saw her at 65, wearing a scarf over her thinning hair, still asking Ruthie whether the dough needed more time. And I saw her hands writing notes in the margin of the blue book. More salt, less pride. Try again. Worth more than her memory. Madison thought she had found a clever line. She had really confessed to the shape of her soul. Daniel whispered her name, but softly, not like a man defending his mother, like a man afraid his wife had said the quiet part too loudly. I asked Daniel if he agreed. He rubbed his face and said I was making this harder than it had to be. He said Mom was gone. He said the bakery needed to survive. He said Madison had found a buyer interested in licensing or acquiring the brand, and if I stopped fighting, everyone could benefit. A buyer. That was the first time I heard it. Madison's eyes narrowed. She had not wanted him to say that yet. I asked what buyer. She said it was preliminary. She said it was business. And she said I would not understand the details. She said I should be grateful. They were trying to turn Eleanor's little bakery into something meaningful. Meaningful, as if feeding people for 34 years had not been meaningful. And I walked to the table and held out my hand for the book. Madison did not move at first. Then Daniel said quietly, to give it to me. She slid it across the steel table, not gently. And the corner hit a flour scoop and bent one page. That small damage hurt more than I expected. I picked up the book and held it against my chest. Madison said I could not hide from business realities forever. And I looked at her then. Really looked. Not as my daughter-in-law. Not as the woman my son had chosen. As someone standing in the kitchen my wife built, holding photographs of stolen pages. And believing age and grief had made me defenseless. I said nothing. That disappointed her. She wanted a fight. She wanted proof I was unstable. She wanted Daniel to see an old man shouting over old paper. I gave her silence. Then I walked into the office, placed the recipe book in my bag, and left the bakery before sunrise. Behind me, I heard Madison tell Daniel that I was becoming a problem. And she was right, just not in the way she thought. I did not fire them that morning. That was the hardest thing I did. Every instinct in me wanted to throw Madison out, drag Daniel by his collar into the alley, and then tell them both that Eleanor's name would not be sold like day-old bread. But anger gives thieves a warning. Silence gives them rope, so I became quiet. I took Eleanor's recipe book home and placed it in the drawer beside our bed, the one where she used to keep lavender hand cream and unread birthday cards. Then I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and wrote down everything I remembered. New logo, changed recipes. Online store, photographs, buyer safe opened, Madison sentence. Daniel silence. I wrote slowly because my hand shook, not from fear, from the effort of keeping grief inside my ribs long enough to think. After sunrise, I called Ruthie and told her to meet me at the bakery but not to say anything to Madison. When Ruthie arrived, I asked if Madison had changed any other recipes. Ruthie reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. She had been saving copies of every new prep sheet, every production note, every instruction Madison gave the staff. Ruthie said Eleanor had taught her to keep records when something felt wrong. That nearly broke me. Even in death, my wife had trained the people who loved her how to survive dishonest ones. Next, I checked the office computer. Madison had not erased enough. There were downloaded files with names like Signature Recipes Phase 1, Founder Story Draft, Table Hearth Acquisition Notes, and Brand Expansion Deck. She had copied customer lists, wholesale accounts, vendor pricing, and photographs of Eleanor at work. She had created a pitch presentation using my wife's face on the first slide. The title read, From Local Legacy to National Artisan Brand. Local Legacy. That was how Madison described the woman whose funeral flowers still sat in my house. In the email drafts, I found the buyer's name, Morning Harbor Coffee Group, and a regional chain with shops across Oregon, Washington, Northern California, and Idaho. They were interested in acquiring certain assets of Eleanor's table, including brand history, and signature recipes, digital storefront, customer list, and product line rights. Madison had written that Daniel Whitman was authorized to negotiate on behalf of the family business, and he was not. Daniel had no ownership, he had no authority. Eleanor and I had never given him shares, not because we did not love him, but because Eleanor believed inheritance should never be handed to someone while they were still learning how to respect work. I printed the emails. Then I called our attorney, Clara Winslow. Clara had handled the bakery lease, our wills, and the trust Eleanor insisted we update after her diagnosis. She was a small woman with sharp gray eyes and the patience of a judge who has already heard every excuse. And when I told her Madison had been photographing the recipe book and negotiating with a buyer, she went quiet. Then she asked if I still had the blue book. I said yes. She told me not to bring it back to the bakery. And that was when I realized Clara knew something I did not. She scheduled me for the next morning. Before seeing her, I did one more thing. I checked the old filing cabinet in the garage where Eleanor kept what she called boring papers. Taxes, vendor agreements, maintenance warranties, old insurance policies, mixer repair receipts, and folders labeled in her careful hand. In the back, behind a folder full of expired health permits, I found one labeled for Arthur if they try to rename me. I sat on the concrete floor for a long time before opening it. Inside were copies of trademark registration documents for Eleanor's table, the logo, the phrase baked for the people we love, and certain product names. There were supplier confidentiality agreements, employee non-disclosure forms, a trust schedule listing the recipe book, brand assets, trade secrets, digital accounts, and bakery goodwill as protected property. There was also a sealed envelope. My name was on it. Arthur. I did not open it that night. I placed it on the kitchen table beside Eleanor's old rolling pin and sat there until the sky turned dark again. For the first time since Madison's insult, I felt something other than pain. I felt Eleanor standing beside me, in the only way she still could prepared. Clara Winslow's office was above a florist on Main Street, which always made me think of funerals even before I had one to remember. In the morning I arrived, the shop below had buckets of white lilies near the door. I almost turned around. Then I touched the folder under my arm and kept walking. Clara greeted me without small talk. She led me into her conference room and asked me to lay everything on the table. The emails, the prep sheets, the online store packaging, the photographs from Madison's pitch deck, and the trademark folder, the sealed letter. Eleanor's blue recipe book stayed at home, just as Clara had instructed when Clara saw the folder labeled for Arthur if they try to rename me. She closed her eyes for a moment. She said Eleanor had been worried. I asked how long. Clara looked at me gently and said, longer than you knew. Then she opened our file. The hidden truth did not arrive like thunder. It arrived page by page, the way truth often does when a careful woman has spent her final months protecting a careless man from being taken apart after she is gone. Eleanor had created the Eleanor Whitman Culinary Trust 18 months before her death. I remembered signing the trust documents, but I had thought it was mostly about taxes and keeping the bakery out of probate. I had been driving her to chemotherapy. Then half my mind had lived in medical waiting rooms. Eleanor had understood that she had used the clarity. She still had to protect what I was too exhausted to examine. The trust named me as sole trustee during my lifetime. Not Daniel, not Madison, me. The trust owned the trademarks, the trade name Eleanor's table, the original logo, the product names, the website domain, the digital storefront, the customer list, the wholesale contracts, the recipe book, the proprietary baking methods, and all goodwill connected to the business. The bakery paid licensing fees to the trust. No sale, licensing deal, rebrand, or transfer of core assets could happen without my written approval. I stared at the pages Eleanor had left me the table, and not just the building, not just the ovens, not just the debt and the grief and the morning cold, the table, the name, the recipes, the right to say no. Clara then showed me a second document, a succession clause. Daniel could inherit a limited share only if he worked in the business for 3 continuous years under my supervision, completed financial training, and did not attempt unauthorized transfer of trust property. Any attempt to sell, rename, dilute, or misuse Eleanor's name without permission would trigger removal from succession. Eleanor had known our son better than I wanted to admit. Then Clara handed me the sealed envelope. I opened it slowly. Eleanor's handwriting was thinner than it had been before the illness, but the letters still leaned forward. She began by telling me not to be angry that she had hidden some details. And she said I was carrying enough while she was sick. She said she trusted my heart completely, but worried that my heart might make excuses for Daniel. After she was gone, she wrote that recipes can be stolen in a way money cannot. And money leaves an account. Recipes leave through flattery, photographs, copies, and people saying it is only food. She wrote that Madison had asked too often about scaling the bakery and whether family recipes could be protected. And she wrote that Daniel loved comfort more than conflict and might stand aside while someone else emptied the room. Then came the line. I read 3 times. Arthur, if they try to sell my name while you are still grieving me, and do not argue with them in the kitchen. Let the papers speak where their ambition has to sit quietly. I had to put the letter down. Clara waited when I could breathe again. She explained what we could do. And we could send cease and desist letters. We could revoke Daniel's access to business systems. We could notify Morning Harbor Coffee Group that Madison had no authority to negotiate. We could preserve evidence for misappropriation of trade secrets, breach of confidentiality, fraud, and attempted conversion of trust assets. If needed, we could file for injunctive relief to stop any use of the name. Recipes, product line, or customer list. The words were legal, cold, useful, but underneath them I heard Eleanor let the papers speak, so we prepared. Clara contacted a forensic specialist to copy the office computer, and not erase it. Ruthie provided signed statements and prep sheets. Our bookkeeper confirmed Daniel had no ownership interest and Madison had never been authorized to access financial or proprietary files. I printed the online store pages before Madison could remove them. Clara saved screenshots of the rebranded packaging. And we ordered copies of the trademark registrations directly from federal records and pulled the trust documents from the official file. Then Clara suggested we let Madison continue just long enough to reveal the buyer meeting. And that sounded cruel to me at first. Clara said it was not cruelty, it was clarity. People who steal family history often hide behind confusion. A formal meeting would remove confusion. And if Madison represented herself as authorized in front of a buyer, an attorney, and witnesses, the evidence would become much stronger. I went home that night with Eleanor's letter in my coat pocket, and the bakery lights were on when I passed by through the window. I saw Madison at the counter, adjusting a display of boxed shortbread under the new table hearth label. Daniel stood behind her, laughing at something on her phone. For a moment, I wanted to walk in and end it there. Instead, I kept walking. The papers were not finished speaking yet. Madison escalated because she mistook my silence for surrender. That is one of the great mistakes greedy people make with old men. They think quiet means empty. They think grief means confusion. They think age means a person has forgotten how to count and sign. Read, remember, and wait. She became almost cheerful around me. She called me Arthur instead of Dad. She said it sounded more professional now that we were entering a new chapter. And she sent staff emails using the title brand director. Though no one had given her that position, she ordered new aprons without Eleanor's name. She changed the bakery voicemail to thank customers for calling Table Hearth, and formerly Eleanor's Table, formerly, as if my wife's name had already been moved into the past tense. Customers noticed. Helen asked me why the bags looked different. A nurse named Marcy said the morning buns tasted lighter and not in a good way. A retired English professor stood near the counter reading the new label and asked who had given Madison permission to turn Eleanor into a footnote. I told him nobody. He nodded and said he had suspected as much. Daniel avoided me more. He came in late, left early, and winced whenever I mentioned his mother. I think guilt was working on him, but guilt without courage is just another locked door. Madison still held the key. One evening Daniel came to the house alone. He stood in the kitchen, where Eleanor used to cool pies on wire racks near the window. He looked tired. Not innocent. Tired. He said Madison had arranged a meeting with Morning Harbor Coffee Group. He said they were interested in a regional product line based on Mom's recipes. He said the money could save the bakery and pay off medical debt and give everyone a future. Everyone. I asked who everyone was. He looked at me like he did not understand. I said Eleanor was not everyone. Eleanor was one person, and his mother my wife. The woman whose name they were trying to license while her handwriting was still warm in the margins. He said I was being unfair. I asked if Madison had told the buyer she owned anything, and he did not answer. Then he said something that sounded like a sentence Madison had rehearsed for him. He said, Mom built something beautiful, but you are too emotional to protect it from becoming small. And small, that word hurt not, because I believed it because my son did. Eleanor's table had been small, proudly small, small enough to remember names, small enough to make soup for a customer whose husband died. Small enough that Eleanor once closed the bakery for half a day to attend the funeral of a dishwasher's mother. small enough that people trusted the food because they trusted the hands that made it. Madison thought small meant weak. Eleanor knew small could mean faithful. Before Daniel left, he placed a document on the table. It was a consent form. Madison had prepared it. The language was broad enough to authorize negotiation, licensing, packaging, digital sales, brand transition, and recipe adaptation. There was a signature line for me, highlighted. I looked at the yellow ink and thought of hospital bracelets, funeral flowers, and Eleanor, sitting in Clara's office months before she died, building a wall with paper because she knew I might be too heartbroken to build one myself. I told Daniel I would review it. He relaxed. That was painful too. My son was relieved because he thought I might sign away his mother's name. After he left, I scanned the consent form and sent it to Clara. Her response was immediate. Excellent evidence. Do not sign. The next day, Madison sent an email to Morning Harbor with Daniel copied. She accidentally copied the bakery's old office email too, the one Eleanor and I still controlled. Madison wrote that the elder owner was emotionally resistant but legally manageable. She wrote that his signature was expected within days. She wrote that the family had agreed in principle to transition away from the Eleanor S. table identity after public rollout. Legally manageable. I printed that email and placed it in growing folder. Then Madison made her cruelest move. She scheduled a private tasting at the bakery using Eleanor S. recipes with Morning Harbor executives, a food consultant, and a photographer. She planned it for the morning of what would have been Eleanor's 71st birthday. When Ruthie told me I had to sit down, Madison knew the date. Everyone in the bakery knew the date. Eleanor used to bake her own birthday cake every year. Not because we would not, but because she said nobody else put enough lemon in the frosting. Madison called the tasting a tribute launch. A tribute, using my wife's birthday to sell her stolen work. That night, I unlocked the drawer beside my bed and took out Eleanor's blue recipe book. I opened to the page for lemon cake. In the margin, she had written, "Arthur likes this one cold from the fridge at midnight." I laughed once, then I cried until my chest hurt. When I was done, I called Clara and told her I was ready. The meeting took place at 11 in the morning in the bakery dining room. Madison had transformed it overnight. The old customer photographs were gone from the wall. The thank you notes near the register had been removed. His framed portrait had been moved from the counter to a side shelf near the restroom hallway, where a stack of delivery boxes half blocked it in the center of the room. Madison had arranged tasting boards with shortbread, sliced morning buns, pear scones, and lemon cake squares labeled under the table hearth name. I arrived 10 minutes after the Morning Harbor group, and that was Clara's idea. Let them begin the lie before you enter with the truth. I walked in wearing my navy jacket, the one Eleanor always said made me look like a man people should not underestimate. And Clara came beside me with 2 folders and a leather briefcase. Ruthie followed us, wiping her hands on her apron, jaw set like stone. Behind us came Leonard Price, our bookkeeper of 19 years, and a representative from the trademark office Clara had arranged as an expert consultant. Mr. Dougherty, the landlord, came too because Madison had told Morning Harbor there was an option to expand into the neighboring unit. And there was not. Madison saw us and froze for half a second. Then she recovered. She smiled brightly and said we were just in time. Daniel stood near the coffee station, pale. The Morning Harbor executives looked polished and cautious. And there were 3 of them. A vice president named Elaine Foster, a legal counsel named Patrick Monroe, and a product development director who had already taken a bite of Eleanor's pear scone and looked confused by the tension in the room. Madison began introductions. She called me the original founder's husband. Not owner, not trustee, not co-founder, the original founder's husband. Clara stepped forward before I could speak and said we needed to correct that before the meeting continued. The room changed immediately. Lawyers have a way of altering air. Madison said this was a family matter. Clara said it became a business and legal matter when Madison represented herself as authorized to negotiate assets she did not own. Patrick Monroe put down his pen. Elaine Foster turned toward Madison slowly. I did not shout. I did not accuse Madison of being what she was. I walked to the table and picked up one of the boxed shortbread samples. The label said Table Hearth Bakehouse. Heritage Lemon Rosemary Shortbread, inspired by Eleanor Whitman's kitchen. Inspired, I placed the box in front of Clara. She opened the first folder. Document by document, she laid out the truth. The trademark registration for Eleanor S. table, the registration for the original logo, the trust schedule listing the recipe book, trade secrets, product names, and customer goodwill, and the LC operating agreement showing Daniel had no ownership interest, the confidentiality agreement signed by employees and family members who worked in the bakery, the access logs showing Madison had entered the office files, and the screenshots of the online store, the pitch deck using Eleanor's photograph, the email stating I was legally manageable, the unsigned consent form Madison had prepared, the prep sheets altering recipes while still using Eleanor's name. Each paper landed on the table softly. Each one hit harder than a shout. Madison's face changed from polished confidence to irritation, then to calculation, then to fear. She said Arthur had known. Clara asked her to produce written authorization. Madison said it was understood. Clara asked her to produce any ownership document. Madison said Daniel was Eleanor's son. Clara asked whether being someone's son automatically transferred trademark rights, trade secrets, and trust assets 6 weeks after a funeral. Patrick Monroe looked at Daniel. Daniel did not speak. Elaine Foster turned to Madison and asked if Morning Harbor had been misled regarding authority. Madison said no, but her voice cracked on the word. Then Clara opened the second folder. This one contained Eleanor's letter. I had not planned to read it aloud. I thought I could let Clara handle the hard parts. But when I saw Eleanor's handwriting, I knew the room needed to hear her not as a brand, and not as a founder, not as a market opportunity, but as a woman who had seen this coming and prepared for it. I held the letter with both hands. My voice shook at first, then it steadied. I read the line Eleanor had left for me. Arthur, if they try to sell my name while you are still grieving me, do not argue with them in the kitchen. Let the papers speak where their ambition has to sit quietly. And nobody moved. Ruthie covered her mouth. Elaine Foster closed her eyes briefly, not dramatically, but like someone who had just realized she was sitting inside another family S-wound. Madison said Eleanor would have wanted growth. I looked at her then. I said Eleanor wanted bread to feed people, not people feeding on her death. Daniel flinched. Madison turned to him, desperate now. She told him to say something. She said this was his mother's legacy too. She said I was destroying his future. She said he had promised they were together on this. And that was the moment my son finally found a spine, though it arrived late and shaking. Daniel said he had never owned the recipes. Madison stared at him. He said he should have stopped her. His voice broke. He said he should have stopped her the first time she changed the labels, the first time she photographed the book, the first time she called his mother's name an asset. He said he had told himself it was business because business sounded cleaner than betrayal. Madison whispered that he was ruining everything. I said she had already tried to ruin the only thing in that room worth protecting. Morning Harbor's attorney stood and stated that the company was suspending all discussions immediately pending legal review. Elaine Foster apologized to me directly. She said they had been told the family had full agreement and that the assets were clear for acquisition. Clara told her any further use of Eleanor's name, recipes, images, customer lists, or derived product materials would be met with immediate legal action. Elaine nodded. Madison sat down as if her legs had disappeared, but the confrontation was not finished. Clara turned to Madison and Daniel and explained the consequences. Madison's access to all business systems was revoked. Any online products using Eleanor's recipes, name, likeness, or marks had to be removed immediately. A preservation demand was being served for all emails. Photographs, copied recipes, packaging designs, pitch materials, sales records, and communications with potential buyers. A claim for damages, unauthorized use of trust property, and trade secret misappropriation and fraud was being prepared. Madison said I would not sue family. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said family does not photograph a dead woman's recipe book before sunrise. And that silenced her. For the first time since Eleanor died, the bakery felt like it belonged to the truth again. The price came in layers. First, Madison lost the deal. Morning Harbor withdrew formally within 48 hours. And their attorney sent a letter confirming that they had relied on representations made by Madison and Daniel, and that they would not proceed with any acquisition, licensing, product development, or brand collaboration without direct authorization from me as trustee. They also returned all pitch materials and certified deletion of copied files. Then the online store came down, and every box labeled Table Hearth disappeared. Every product description using Eleanor's name was removed. Every photograph of her recipe book was preserved for evidence before deletion. And Clara made sure nothing vanished without being documented first. Madison hated that. People who manipulate stories cannot stand when someone saves the original draft. The bakery voicemail changed back. Thank you for calling Eleanor's table. First time I heard it again, I had to sit in the office with the door closed. Then came the legal papers. Clara filed claims against Madison for unauthorized use of trust property, misappropriation of confidential business materials, false representation of authority, and damage to the Eleanor's Table brand. Daniel was not spared. He had not taken the photographs, but he had opened doors, stood beside her, copied emails, and allowed her to speak as if she had rights she did not possess. Clara made sure he understood that silence beside theft does not become innocence just because the thief talks louder. Madison called me once before the formal complaint was filed. I answered because I thought it might be Daniel. She did not apologize. She said I was emotional. She said Eleanor would be disappointed that I was keeping the bakery small out of pride. And she said, women like her understood how to turn recipes into real money, she said. If I went forward, I would destroy Daniel's marriage. I told her she had mistaken Eleanor's kindness for weakness and my grief for permission. And then I hung up. Daniel came alone a week later before opening hands in his coat pockets, looking like the boy who used to wait for Eleanor to sneak him the first broken cookie from the cooling rack. I unlocked the door but did not move aside. Right away, he said he was sorry. I asked for what. He looked down at the sidewalk, wet from rain, and said he was sorry for letting Madison talk about his mother like she was a product. Sorry for opening the safe. Sorry for not stopping the online store. Sorry for bringing me the consent form. Sorry for wanting the money badly enough to pretend he did not see the theft. That was the first honest sentence he had given me in months. I let him inside, but only to the front table. Not the kitchen, not the office. Some rooms have to be earned back. Daniel cried when he saw Eleanor's portrait back on the counter. I did not comfort him quickly. A father's hands remember how to comfort a child, but a grieving husband's heart remembers who stayed silent while his wife was disrespected. And so I let him cry. Then I told him the trust would be amended. He was removed from any automatic succession. If he wanted any future role in Eleanor's table, he would begin as an employee. Paid hourly, supervised by Ruthie with no access to recipes, accounts, legal documents, or vendor systems. He would complete business ethics training, financial management classes, and 3 years of honest work before I would even consider restoring limited responsibility. He said that sounded harsh. I said so was hearing his wife say Eleanor's recipes were worth more than her memory. He nodded. Madison refused settlement at first. She hired a lawyer who tried to frame everything as a family misunderstanding and modernization effort. Then Clara produced the email calling me legally manageable. The phone photographs, the buyer pitch, the altered prep sheets, the rebrand files, the consent form. Eleanor's trust, the tone changed. Eventually, Madison agreed to a settlement. She paid damages from funds she had expected to invest in her own consulting business. She signed a permanent agreement barring her from using Eleanor's name, recipes, likeness, product names, customer lists, trade secrets, or any confusingly similar brand tied to the bakery. She also agreed to return or destroy every copied file under forensic supervision. Her reputation suffered quietly at first, then publicly enough. Morning Harbor's legal team had not appreciated being misled. 2 marketing clients dropped her. A local business group removed her from a panel about women entrepreneurs after Ruthie, who usually hated gossip, simply forwarded the public court filing to one person who needed to see it. That was all it took. Truth travels fastest when it is carried by people who never wanted drama in the first place. Daniel and Madison separated before winter. He told me in a letter, not in person. He wrote that he had spent years letting confidence impress him more than character. He wrote that Eleanor had tried to warn him gently, and I had tried to warn him silently, and he had chosen the person who made greed sound like strategy. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, not with Eleanor's things. Not yet. Daniel began working at the bakery in January. Ruthie made him scrub sheet pans for 2 weeks. Before letting him touch dough, he did not complain, or if he did, he had the sense not to do it where I could hear. He arrived at 4:30. He learned how to scale flour. He learned why cheap honey ruined the scones. He learned that proofing dough could not be rushed, just because a spreadsheet preferred efficiency. One morning, I saw him standing over the mixer crying quietly. Ruthie asked if he was hurt. He said no. He said he had just realized how early his mother had woken up for him every day. And that did not fix everything, but it was a beginning with flour on its hands. The first morning we put Eleanor's handwritten menu cards back in the pastry case. The whole bakery seemed to exhale. And Ruthie brought them from the office in a small stack tied with twine. The cards were stained, bent, and uneven. Lemon rosemary shortbread, honey pear scones, cardamom morning buns, and cinnamon plum rolls. Eleanor had written each one in blue ink, with letters that grew larger whenever she was excited about a new recipe. Madison would have called them inconsistent with the visual identity. I called them home. We placed Eleanor's portrait beside the register where customers could see her when they walked in. Not on a side shelf, not near delivery boxes, at the center of the room she had built. I polished the frame myself. Ruthie set a small vase of yellow tulips beside it because Eleanor hated white flowers unless they were in someone else's garden. The old sign above the door had never come down, but for weeks I had feared losing it. Now I stood outside in the cold morning and looked up at the words Eleanor's table. The paint was faded. A corner of the sign needed repair. The lettering was not modern, not sleek, not scalable. It was beautiful. Daniel stood beside me, holding a ladder. He asked if I wanted him to repaint it. I said not yet. Some weather marks are proof. Something endured. We reopened fully under the original name on a Saturday. I expected a normal morning, maybe a few regulars, maybe some awkward questions. Instead, people lined up down the block before 7, and Helen came with flowers. Marcy brought 3 nurses from the hospital. The retired professor brought a handwritten note about Eleanor and placed it near the register. Mr. Doherty, the landlord, bought 24 scones and said his wife had threatened him if he came home without them. By noon, we had sold out of everything but oatmeal cookies, which Eleanor always said were punished by their own virtue. And people did not come because of branding. They came because memory had a smell. Butter browning in the oven, coffee dripping into glass pots, orange zest on Ruthie's hands, raincoats drying near the door, and the bell above the entrance ringing the same way it had rung for 34 years. Near closing, an older woman I barely knew touched my arm and said Eleanor had once given her free bread during a winter when her husband lost work. And she said she had never forgotten. Then she bought 1 loaf and paid for 5. That was Eleanor's business model. Feed people until they remember they belong to the world. After the legal settlement, and Clara helped me restructure the bakery. The trust remained in control of the name, recipes, and intellectual property. Ruthie received a formal profit-sharing agreement because loyalty should not be rewarded only with kind words. A local culinary student named Grace joined us part-time. Eleanor had once paid her application fee for community college after hearing her cry in the restroom. Grace never forgot, and she handled online orders honestly, with Eleanor's name respected and protected. We did create a modest online store again. Not Madison's version, no fake founder story, no blurred recipe pages used as decoration. No language about scaling a legacy. Just simple boxes of shortbread, scone mix, and coffee cake, with a card inside that told the truth. Eleanor Whitman baked for people, not markets. And every purchase helps keep her table open. That sentence sold more than Madison's entire pitch deck. Daniel kept working. At first, customers looked at him carefully. Some knew enough to judge him, and some knew nothing. He accepted both. He washed dishes, carried flour, took out trash, and learned to apologize without asking the other person to make him feel better afterward. And that last part took longest. One evening, months after the confrontation, he asked if he could read Eleanor's letter. I said no. His face fell, but he nodded. Then I said not yet. There is a difference. In spring, we held a small gathering for what would have been Eleanor's 72nd birthday. Not a tribute launch, not a marketing event, just family and staff, regular customers, and anyone who had loved her food. Ruthie baked the lemon cake because I still could not make the frosting right. Daniel made the coffee. Grace printed small cards with Eleanor's favorite line from the recipe book and feed them like someone is waiting for them at home. We placed 1 card at every table. I stood near the counter watching people read it. Some smiled, some cried, some folded the card and tucked it into purses or jacket pockets. And the bakery became quiet in the gentle way a room becomes quiet when everyone inside it is remembering the same person differently. Daniel came to stand beside me. He said Mom would have liked this. And I said yes. She would have complained that the lemon cake needed more zest, but she would have liked it. He laughed softly, then he cried. This time I put my hand on his shoulder, and not because everything was forgiven, because grief had taught me that forgiveness is not one door swinging open. It is a long hallway with many locked rooms. Some stay locked, and some open later. Some open only a crack. That day a crack was enough. Madison never returned to the bakery. She sent 1 email through her attorney expressing regret for the misunderstanding. And Clara read it first and asked if I wanted to respond. I said, no. Misunderstanding is what happens when someone hears salt instead of sugar. Photographing a dead woman's recipe book before sunrise is not misunderstanding. It is a choice. I let the silence answer her. A year after Eleanor's death, I finally opened the blue recipe book without feeling like it would split me in half. I sat at the prep table before dawn, the same table where I had found Madison stealing photographs. The ovens were warming. The street outside was dark. Rain tapped softly at the windows. Daniel was in the back unloading flour, and Ruthie was humming to herself near the mixer. Grace was setting out coffee cups. The bakery was alive in small sounds. I turned to the page for cinnamon plum rolls. Eleanor's notes filled the margins. And use ripe plums, not pretty ones. Arthur thinks more butter. He is annoyingly right. Daniel likes extra glaze when he is sad. Do not let anyone rush the second rise. That last line stopped me. And do not let anyone rush the second rise. I touched the words with 1 finger. Dough rises once because yeast does what it was made to do. Then you press it down, shape it, let it rise again. And the second rise is quieter, slower, more fragile. But without it, the bread never becomes what it is meant to be. Maybe people are like that too. Maybe families are. Maybe old men are. And Madison had tried to rush grief into profit. Daniel had tried to rush guilt into forgiveness. I had almost rushed pain into anger, because anger felt stronger than heartbreak, but Eleanor, even in a margin meant for dough, had left me another lesson. Do not rush the second rise, so I did not. I kept the bakery small enough to remember names. I kept the trust strong enough to protect her work. I kept Daniel close enough to learn and far enough from control. I kept Madison outside every locked door. I kept Ruthie paid well, I kept Grace learning. I kept Eleanor's portrait by the register. And sometimes, when the morning light came through the front windows just right, I could almost see my wife at table 4, cup of tea in hand, watching all of us try again one night after closing. And I stood alone in the bakery and turned off the lights. One by one, the ovens were cooling. The pastry case was empty. The floors had been mopped. Outside, the sign glowed softly against the wet street. Eleanor's table. Her name was safe. Her recipes were safe. Her memory was safe, and the love Madison thought could not pay the bills was still paying them every morning, one honest loaf at a time.